What if I told you that in the dead of night, a single operation in Caracas may have quietly redrawn the map of global power, and almost nobody fully understands what it could mean for the future of the Western Hemisphere? The story begins with whispers that quickly turn into rotor blades slicing through humid Venezuelan air as American helicopters descend toward a heavily guarded military compound in the capital, carrying with them a mission that would shock the world and ignite one of the most controversial geopolitical debates of the decade. Within minutes, chaos unfolds behind closed gates, and by the time the sun begins to hint at the horizon, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, a leader who had endured years of sanctions, mass protests, political isolation, and international pressure, is reportedly taken into custody and transported under heavy guard toward an American naval vessel waiting offshore. The official explanation would later revolve around narcoterrorism charges and international law enforcement cooperation. But behind the headlines and political theater, analysts and intelligence observers begin to piece together a far more complex and unsettling narrative. This was not simply about removing a controversial leader, and it was not only about dismantling alleged criminal networks. It was about something much bigger, something that had been building quietly for decades while global attention remained focused on wars in the Middle East, counterterrorism campaigns, and rising tensions in Eastern Europe and Asia. To understand the true stakes, we have to step back and examine a transformation that has taken place across Latin America, a transformation driven not by military invasions or ideological revolutions, but by infrastructure deals, energy investments, trade partnerships, and strategic resource acquisitions that have gradually reshaped economic loyalties throughout the region. Over the last quarter century, China has expanded its influence in Latin America at a pace few predicted, and even fewer in Washington fully appreciated until recently, turning what was once considered America's uncontested sphere of influence into a fiercely competitive geopolitical arena. At the start of the millennium, China's trade presence in Latin America was relatively small, almost insignificant in the broader global economy. But over the years that followed, trade volumes exploded as Chinese companies invested billions into mining operations, energy grids, agricultural partnerships, and transportation infrastructure that allowed Latin American economies to diversify their trading partners and reduce reliance on traditional Western markets. By the mid-2020s, China had become the largest trading partner for several major South American economies, including Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and Argentina, creating economic interdependence that reshaped political calculations across the continent and forced leaders to balance relations between two competing global superpowers. One of the most striking examples of this shift emerged in Peru, where Chinese-backed companies financed and developed a massive deep-water port designed to handle the largest cargo vessels in the world, significantly reducing shipping times between Asia and South America, while bypassing logistical routes historically dominated by North American ports. The project symbolized more than commercial efficiency. It represented a strategic corridor connecting Asian manufacturing hubs directly with South American resource exporters, strengthening China's access to raw materials while offering Latin American nations faster and cheaper access to global markets. Beyond ports and shipping lanes, Chinese state-owned enterprises also invested heavily in Latin America's electrical infrastructure, constructing ultra-high voltage transmission lines capable of delivering renewable energy across vast distances and helping power some of the region's largest metropolitan areas. These investments provided tangible economic benefits for local populations, improving energy reliability, expanding industrial capacity, and supporting long-term development projects that many governments had struggled to finance through domestic resources alone. At the same time, Chinese companies quietly secured access to critical minerals, particularly lithium reserves located in the so-called lithium triangle spanning Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, an area believed to hold a majority of the world's known lithium supply, a resource essential for manufacturing electric vehicle batteries and supporting the global transition toward renewable energy technologies. For the United States, which is attempting to expand domestic electric vehicle production and reduce dependence on fossil fuels, access to lithium is not merely an economic issue, but a national security priority, making Chinese partnerships in the region increasingly alarming to policymakers and defense strategists. From Washington's perspective, what unfolded over 2 decades was not simply foreign investment, but the gradual construction of a rival economic network operating inside a region historically viewed as strategically vital to American security and prosperity. The concept that underpinned American dominance in the Western Hemisphere for nearly 2 centuries, known as the Monroe Doctrine, originally warned foreign powers against establishing influence or military presence in the Americas. And while the doctrine evolved over time, its symbolic importance remained deeply embedded in U.S. foreign policy thinking. As Chinese investment projects multiplied across Latin America, many within the American national security establishment began to argue that the Monroe Doctrine was being undermined not through military confrontation, but through economic integration that could eventually translate into political and strategic alignment with Beijing. Against this backdrop, the dramatic operation involving Maduro's capture takes on an entirely different significance, appearing less like an isolated enforcement action and more like a signal that Washington is prepared to reassert influence in the region through a combination of economic pressure, diplomatic leverage, and, if necessary, military capability. Political figures and policy advisors close to the White House begin describing this emerging strategy as a modern reinterpretation of historical American Hemisphere doctrine, one that prioritizes limiting external influence from rival global powers and strengthening alliances with governments willing to align with U.S. economic and security interests. Critics warn that such a strategy risks escalating tensions, potentially forcing Latin American nations into choosing sides between 2 global giants rather than maintaining the balanced multi-alignment strategies that many governments have pursued successfully for years. Supporters argue that failing to counter China's expanding footprint would leave the United States vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, strategic resource shortages, and diminished global influence. As news spreads and speculation intensifies, leaders across Latin America begin reassessing their foreign policy positions, recognizing that the region may be entering a new era of geopolitical competition unlike anything seen since the Cold War, an era where infrastructure projects, trade agreements, and resource contracts could determine alliances as decisively as military treaties once did. While the world debates the legality, morality, and long-term consequences of the Venezuelan operation, one reality becomes increasingly clear. The balance of power in the Western Hemisphere is shifting, and the events unfolding in Caracas may represent the opening chapter of a much larger struggle that will shape international relations, economic development, and strategic security across the Americas for decades to come. As global tension continues to build following the shocking geopolitical event introduced in the first part, the ripple effects begin to surface across international alliances, financial systems, and public perception, creating a fragile atmosphere where uncertainty becomes the dominant force shaping political and economic decision-making. Governments that once maintained cautious neutrality now find themselves pressured to choose positions, while intelligence agencies quietly increase surveillance operations, attempting to anticipate potential retaliatory actions and internal destabilization campaigns that could emerge as a consequence of shifting power structures. Within diplomatic circles, emergency meetings take place behind closed doors as leaders attempt to interpret not only the immediate consequences, but also the long-term strategic realignment that may redefine regional influence, energy distribution, and international trade agreements. Financial markets respond with volatility, reflecting investor anxiety as commodities tied to the affected region experience sudden price fluctuations, forcing multinational corporations to reassess supply chains and risk management protocols to protect assets and maintain operational continuity. Meanwhile, media organizations compete to control the narrative, broadcasting conflicting reports that amplify public confusion and fuel speculation, which in turn intensifies social media debates and contributes to the rapid spread of misinformation, creating a climate where public trust in institutions begins to erode. On the ground, populations directly connected to the unfolding situation experience heightened emotional tension as families worry about economic security, potential migration pressures, and the possibility of military escalation, while humanitarian organizations quietly begin contingency planning for scenarios that could require rapid deployment of aid resources. At the same time, strategic analysts warn that moments like these often expose hidden vulnerabilities within global governance frameworks, highlighting how interconnected modern political systems have become, where a single destabilizing event can influence not only regional stability, but also global security dynamics. Intelligence leaks start surfacing through unofficial channels, suggesting that multiple actors may attempt to exploit the power vacuum or political distraction to advance their own agendas, raising concerns about cyber attacks, covert operations, and proxy conflicts that could unfold without immediate public awareness. Economic advisors within major governments begin modeling various response strategies, debating whether sanctions, diplomatic mediation, or strategic partnerships will prove most effective in maintaining stability while protecting national interests. Yet no consensus emerges, as each option carries unpredictable risks. As military leadership across several nations increases readiness levels without formally announcing escalation, defense analysts monitor troop movements, naval deployments, and airspace activity, interpreting each maneuver as a potential signal of future intentions, further heightening global alertness. Simultaneously, internal political divisions within several countries intensify as opposition parties challenge government responses, accusing leadership of either overreaction or dangerous passivity, turning the international crisis into a domestic political battleground that could influence upcoming elections and reshape national policy agendas. Academic institutions and geopolitical think tanks publish rapid analyses, attempting to forecast the long-term transformation of international relations, suggesting that the current crisis may accelerate the transition toward a multipolar world order where emerging powers gain increased influence, while traditional superpowers struggle to maintain their historical dominance. Cultural and ideological narratives also begin to shift, as commentators frame the unfolding events through lenses of historical rivalry, economic competition, and philosophical debates about sovereignty, intervention, and global responsibility, further polarizing public opinion across different regions. Meanwhile, within the affected nation itself, uncertainty spreads through governmental institutions as bureaucratic networks attempt to maintain administrative continuity despite leadership instability, revealing how fragile centralized systems can become when authority structures are suddenly disrupted. Underground political factions and grassroots movements cautiously begin organizing, each interpreting the moment as either an opportunity for reform or a threat requiring resistance, adding another layer of unpredictability to the evolving landscape. Technology companies and cybersecurity agencies issue warnings about increased digital espionage attempts, recognizing that information control has become one of the most critical battlegrounds in modern geopolitical conflict, where controlling narratives can influence international legitimacy as powerfully as military action. As humanitarian observers stress the importance of preventing civilian suffering, negotiations emerge among international organizations seeking to establish monitoring missions and conflict de-escalation frameworks. Though progress remains slow due to competing national priorities and mistrust among global stakeholders. Energy markets become particularly sensitive as speculation about supply disruptions leads to emergency discussions among major producing nations, some of which see the crisis as an opportunity to expand influence by offering alternative supply routes or strategic alliances. At the same time, historical parallels begin circulating among scholars who compare the present moment to previous geopolitical turning points, warning that miscalculations during periods of rapid transformation often lead to prolonged instability rather than swift resolution. As night falls across multiple world capitals, emergency operations centers remain active, processing intelligence updates, diplomatic communications, and economic indicators, all while decision-makers confront the sobering realization that the unfolding situation may represent not just a temporary crisis, but the beginning of a structural shift in global power distribution. Setting the stage for complex negotiations, hidden confrontations, and unpredictable developments that will shape the trajectory of the story as it progresses into the next phase. As the global landscape continues to shift following the mounting uncertainty and rising strategic alertness described previously, world leaders begin transitioning from observation to calculated action, initiating a series of carefully coordinated yet discreet diplomatic maneuvers designed to prevent uncontrolled escalation while simultaneously protecting national interests in an increasingly unstable environment. Intelligence agencies intensify collaboration through back-channel communications, exchanging classified assessments that reveal a growing concern that secondary actors, nations and non-state groups not initially involved, may attempt to exploit the crisis to gain territorial, economic, or ideological leverage, thereby expanding the scope of instability beyond its original boundaries. Within major financial capitals, emergency economic task forces convene to evaluate contingency plans that include currency stabilization measures, trade rerouting strategies, and emergency liquidity provisions aimed at preventing cascading market collapses as investors remain cautious, closely monitoring government statements for signals that could either restore confidence or trigger deeper financial turbulence. Meanwhile, international diplomatic envoys begin traveling between key global capitals in rapid succession, attempting to establish preliminary frameworks for dialogue that could prevent the breakdown of existing alliances while cautiously exploring the formation of new strategic partnerships that reflect the emerging geopolitical reality. Military analysts observe subtle but significant changes in defense postures, noting that several nations begin repositioning assets to reinforce defensive readiness rather than overt aggression, signaling an attempt to deter potential opportunistic threats without provoking direct confrontation. Yet the increased visibility of these movements further fuels global speculation about possible conflict scenarios. In parallel, humanitarian organizations escalate preparedness operations, coordinating with regional governments to pre-position medical supplies, food reserves, and refugee support infrastructure, recognizing that even without direct warfare, economic instability and political uncertainty can trigger widespread civilian displacement and humanitarian strain. Inside legislative chambers across multiple democracies, political leaders engage in intense debates regarding foreign policy responses, with factions advocating for stronger interventionist stances clashing against those urging diplomatic patience and multilateral negotiation, revealing how international crises often expose deep ideological divisions within domestic political systems. Academic and strategic policy institutions release comprehensive scenario forecasts outlining potential future trajectories, including negotiated stabilization, prolonged cold standoff, or fragmented regional conflicts, each carrying distinct global implications that influence government planning and public expectations. Simultaneously, media ecosystems evolve into contested arenas of influence where state-sponsored messaging campaigns, independent investigative journalism, and social media discourse collide, shaping global public perception while raising concerns about information manipulation, psychological operations, and the erosion of objective truth in times of crisis. Cybersecurity experts report an unprecedented surge in digital probing activities targeting infrastructure networks, financial institutions, and government databases, prompting emergency digital defense initiatives designed to prevent cyber sabotage that could magnify existing instability or create additional crises capable of overwhelming response capabilities. As international energy councils convene emergency sessions, debates intensify over supply diversification and strategic reserve deployment, recognizing that energy security has become one of the most immediate and sensitive variables influencing economic resilience and diplomatic leverage during the unfolding situation. At the same time, cultural and societal reactions begin surfacing across global populations, with public demonstrations emerging in major cities where citizens express fear, patriotism, economic anxiety, or ideological solidarity, depending on regional perspectives and media narratives. illustrating how geopolitical crises extend far beyond leadership circles and deeply influence collective societal psychology. Within the affected region itself, administrative institutions struggle to maintain governance continuity as internal power negotiations unfold among political elites, military leadership, and civil authorities attempting to prevent systemic collapse while cautiously navigating the uncertain legitimacy of emerging leadership structures. Underground resistance movements and reformist coalitions cautiously expand recruitment and messaging efforts, interpreting the instability as either an opportunity to reshape governance models or a dangerous period requiring organized defense of existing institutions, thereby adding layers of internal unpredictability that external observers struggle to fully interpret. Strategic economic alliances begin undergoing quiet renegotiations as multinational corporations reassess investment exposure and supply chain dependencies, sometimes accelerating the relocation of production facilities or forming new cross-border partnerships to reduce vulnerability to geopolitical shocks, signaling a long-term transformation of global commerce patterns that may persist long after the immediate crisis subsides. Meanwhile, international legal organizations and diplomatic councils explore the possibility of convening extraordinary summits aimed at establishing crisis management frameworks, conflict de-escalation protocols, and monitoring mechanisms designed to reduce the risk of miscalculation among competing global powers. Although persistent mistrust and conflicting national priorities slow progress toward meaningful consensus, defense strategists caution that historical precedents demonstrate how prolonged periods of strategic ambiguity often increase the likelihood of accidental escalation, emphasizing the importance of communication channels between rival states. Yet maintaining such channels proves politically sensitive as public rhetoric in several nations grows increasingly nationalistic in response to domestic pressure. As intelligence assessments continue evolving, analysts warn that the crisis is gradually transitioning from a reactive phase into a transformative global recalibration, where alliances, economic dependencies, and ideological influence structures may permanently shift, creating a new international order that could redefine power distribution for decades. As dawn approaches across several strategic command centers worldwide, policymakers confront an unsettling realization that the situation has moved beyond crisis containment and entered a stage of structural transformation, setting the stage for decisive negotiations, covert strategic competitions, and potentially historic diplomatic breakthroughs or catastrophic miscalculations that will ultimately determine the trajectory of global stability in the chapters that follow. As the crisis evolves from a phase of strategic recalibration into one defined by decisive positioning, global power centers begin to reveal their long-term intentions through a combination of diplomatic signaling, economic restructuring, and subtle military coordination, demonstrating that the uncertainty described previously is gradually transforming into a contest for influence that will likely determine the architecture of the next international order. Behind closed doors, high-level negotiations intensify among major alliances, where policymakers attempt to balance deterrence with dialogue, understanding that overly aggressive strategies could accelerate confrontation, while excessive caution might invite opportunistic expansion by rival actors seeking to exploit perceived weakness. Intelligence networks report increasing patterns of covert negotiations occurring simultaneously with public diplomatic statements, suggesting that governments are carefully crafting dual-track strategies that preserve public confidence while privately exploring compromise frameworks designed to stabilize the situation without sacrificing geopolitical leverage. Financial institutions, still navigating market volatility, begin adapting to what analysts describe as a new risk baseline, where long-term investment planning must now incorporate persistent geopolitical instability as a structural economic variable rather than a temporary disruption, forcing multinational corporations to accelerate diversification strategies that reshape global trade routes, manufacturing hubs, and technological research partnerships. Meanwhile, Energy coalitions finalize emergency distribution agreements intended to minimize supply disruptions. Yet these agreements unintentionally strengthen certain emerging regional powers that gain influence by acting as alternative energy providers, further accelerating the multipolar transformation that analysts predicted in earlier assessments. Military observers continue tracking defense postures, noting that several nations shift from precautionary readiness toward integrated strategic exercises designed to demonstrate alliance cohesion and technological capability. Moves that are publicly framed as defensive, but widely interpreted by strategic experts as demonstrations of deterrence designed to influence negotiation dynamics. Within legislative arenas, internal political tensions deepen as policymakers face pressure from citizens demanding economic stability, national security assurances, and transparent leadership communication, creating political environments where foreign policy decisions become deeply intertwined with domestic electoral survival, sometimes pushing leaders toward symbolic actions intended to demonstrate strength, even when such gestures risk complicating diplomatic negotiations. Across global media platforms, narrative competition intensifies as governments, independent analysts, and grassroots activists attempt to define the moral and strategic interpretation of unfolding events, recognizing that controlling public perception can significantly influence international legitimacy and alliance solidarity. While misinformation campaigns further complicate efforts to maintain objective public understanding of the crisis. Cybersecurity agencies report increasingly sophisticated digital infiltration attempts targeting not only government infrastructure, but also private sector communication networks, research institutions, and media organizations, highlighting how modern geopolitical competition has expanded into the digital domain where information disruption can achieve strategic objectives without traditional military confrontation. Humanitarian organizations, observing the prolonged instability, begin shifting from short-term emergency preparedness toward long-term resilience planning, collaborating with regional authorities to strengthen healthcare systems, economic recovery programs, and refugee integration strategies, acknowledging that the social consequences of geopolitical instability often persist long after diplomatic resolutions are reached. Within the region at the center of the crisis, internal governance negotiations intensify as competing political and institutional factions attempt to construct a transitional authority capable of maintaining administrative continuity while seeking international recognition. A delicate process complicated by external actors attempting to influence leadership outcomes to align with their broader strategic interests. Grassroots reform movements expand organizational structures, using digital communication tools to mobilize public engagement, while traditional power institutions attempt to maintain stability by reinforcing administrative control and security presence, creating an internal environment characterized by cautious reform momentum balanced against institutional preservation. Economic alliances undergo accelerated transformation as trade blocs begin renegotiating tariff structures, technology sharing agreements, and resource partnerships to reflect the evolving global balance of power, signaling a structural shift in international commerce that may redefine economic globalization patterns for decades. Strategic think tanks publish increasingly complex scenario models illustrating potential outcomes ranging from successful diplomatic restructuring to prolonged ideological rivalry, resembling historical cold confrontation periods, with each scenario influencing government planning strategies and defense budgeting priorities. International legal bodies continue exploring the possibility of convening emergency multilateral conferences designed to formalize crisis resolution frameworks, although progress remains constrained by lingering mistrust among major powers, many of whom remain reluctant to commit to binding agreements that could limit future strategic flexibility. Defense analysts warn that as military exercises and strategic demonstrations increase, the margin for misinterpretation also expands, raising the risk that symbolic deterrence actions could be mistaken for offensive preparation, underscoring the critical importance of maintaining open communication channels even among rival states. Cultural reactions continue evolving as artists, scholars, and public intellectuals begin interpreting the crisis through historical, philosophical, and ethical frameworks, shaping public discourse about sovereignty, global responsibility, and the moral limits of intervention, demonstrating how geopolitical conflicts influence not only political and economic systems, but also cultural and intellectual narratives that define collective historical memory. As global command centers continue processing intelligence updates and diplomatic communications, policymakers gradually recognize that the crisis has moved beyond immediate stabilization efforts and entered a decisive phase where strategic decisions made within a narrow window of opportunity will likely determine whether the emerging world order evolves toward cooperative multipolar stability or fragmented rivalry, characterized by persistent tension, setting the stage for high stakes negotiations, covert strategic contests, and potentially transformative diplomatic breakthroughs that will guide the unfolding narrative into its next chapter. As the decisive phase begins to unfold following the mounting strategic demonstrations and fragile diplomatic positioning described previously, global leaders move into what many analysts describe as the most dangerous yet potentially transformative moment of the crisis, where negotiation opportunities and escalation risks exist simultaneously, forcing policymakers to operate within an environment where every public statement, military maneuver, or economic adjustment carries amplified consequences across the interconnected international system. Secret diplomatic summits begin occurring in neutral territories, where senior negotiators representing rival alliances engage intense discussions aimed at establishing temporary stabilization agreements that could reduce immediate confrontation risks while allowing each side to preserve strategic dignity. Recognizing that modern geopolitical conflicts are rarely resolved through absolute victory, but rather through complex compromises that redefine influence without direct military domination. Intelligence agencies provide increasingly detailed reports suggesting that several secondary regional powers are quietly expanding their own diplomatic outreach efforts, attempting to position themselves as mediators or strategic beneficiaries capable of strengthening their international relevance during the ongoing power transition. A development that further complicates negotiation frameworks by introducing additional stakeholders with competing priorities. Financial markets, which have spent months reacting to uncertainty, begin demonstrating cautious patterns of adaptation as investors redirect capital toward industries and regions perceived as stable within the new geopolitical environment, accelerating the redistribution of global economic influence, while forcing traditional financial centers to implement regulatory reforms designed to maintain competitiveness in a rapidly evolving economic landscape. Meanwhile, multinational corporations intensify restructuring initiatives, forming cross-border partnerships, relocating manufacturing facilities, and investing heavily in technological automation to reduce vulnerability to geopolitical disruption, signaling a long-term shift in global supply chain architecture that may permanently alter patterns of trade and industrial development. Military leadership across major alliances begins transitioning from symbolic readiness demonstrations toward integrated strategic deterrence planning, coordinating defense technologies, intelligence sharing, and rapid response capabilities designed to discourage opportunistic aggression while avoiding overt escalation. Yet the increasing sophistication of these defense systems introduces new strategic uncertainties, particularly regarding autonomous warfare technologies and cyber defense, capabilities that could rapidly escalate conflicts if miscalculated. Domestic political environments across several nations grow increasingly volatile as economic pressure and public anxiety intensify, leading to mass political debates, policy protests, and electoral realignments that force leaders to balance international diplomacy with internal political survival, often complicating negotiation flexibility as concessions abroad may be interpreted domestically as political weakness. Media ecosystems continue evolving into powerful battlegrounds of influence, where state-sponsored information campaigns, investigative journalism, and independent digital commentators compete to shape public interpretation of events, creating parallel narratives that influence international legitimacy. alliance cohesion, and citizen morale. While misinformation networks exploit public uncertainty to spread divisive content capable of destabilizing democratic discourse. Cybersecurity authorities report escalating levels of coordinated digital espionage targeting research laboratories, defense contractors, and diplomatic communication systems, prompting unprecedented collaboration between private technology companies and government security agencies to protect critical information infrastructure. Recognizing that digital intelligence dominance has become as strategically valuable as traditional military superiority. Humanitarian organizations, acknowledging the prolonged nature of the crisis, begin implementing comprehensive recovery planning initiatives focused on economic rehabilitation, infrastructure reconstruction, and social stabilization programs within vulnerable regions, working alongside international development agencies to prevent long-term humanitarian deterioration that could fuel additional geopolitical instability. Within the central region of political transformation, transitional governance negotiations reach a critical stage as competing political coalitions attempt to establish constitutional frameworks capable of balancing reform demands with institutional continuity. A process complicated by external actors attempting to influence leadership selection and policy direction to align with broader strategic objectives, while grassroots civic organizations mobilize public participation campaigns, advocating transparency, accountability, and democratic representation during the transitional period. Economic alliances across continents continue renegotiating trade policies, technology exchange agreements, and resource partnerships to reflect shifting global influence patterns, gradually constructing a new economic ecosystem where regional cooperation blocs gain greater autonomy and strategic significance compared to previous globalization models dominated by singular superpower influence. Strategic think tanks release comprehensive predictive models illustrating potential long-term outcomes, including stabilized multipolar cooperation, prolonged ideological competition, or fragmented regional security coalitions, each scenario influencing defense planning, infrastructure investment, and diplomatic engagement strategies across multiple continents. International legal institutions intensify efforts to establish multilateral crisis resolution conferences designed to create binding agreements regarding conflict prevention, cyber warfare regulation, and economic sanctions frameworks, although persistent distrust among global powers continues limiting progress toward enforceable global governance mechanisms. Defense analysts warn that the increasing complexity of integrated military alliances and emerging technological warfare capabilities has significantly reduced response time windows during potential conflict scenarios, increasing the risk that accidental misinterpretation or technical malfunction could trigger rapid escalation before diplomatic channels can intervene. Emphasizing the urgent necessity of maintaining transparent communication pathways between rival states.